Believe it or not, Cuba dates back to before Ricky Ricardo. It is Christopher Columbus who discovers the Caribbean's largest island for the West in 1492. Diego Velázquez de Cuellar sails with Columbus, returning in 1510 to establish Spain's colony. The Taíno Indians revolt. Leader Hatuey burned at the stake, but celebrated today in a local beer. African slaves arrive in 1527. By 1868, Spain's New World possessions are reduced to Cuba and Puerto Rico. Cuban sugar planter Carlos Manuel de Céspedes frees his slaves, forms a battalion, and launches the unsuccessful 10 Years' War. Slavery is abolished in 1886. The visionary and poet José Martí rekindles the revolution in 1895, touring the United States to raise funds. Killed in his first battle, Martí inspires General Máximo Gómez and his rebel army to steady victories. Spain cracks down. A new governor, General Valeriano Weyler, opts for a policy of concentration camps and mass starvation that increasingly outrages the American public. President William McKinley dispatches the battleship Maine to Havana. On February 15, 1898, she mysteriously explodes and sinks, killing 274. The penny press of Hearst and Pulitzer instantly blames Madrid, fanning the flame for war.
McKinley called for volunteers, then I got my gun. First Spaniard I saw coming, I shot him on the run. It was all about that battleship of Maine.
General William Shafter embarks an expeditionary force for Santiago de Cuba in the southeast, where Admiral Pascual Cervera's Spanish fleet is blockaded in the harbor by American ships. Landing at Daiquiri and Siboney, the Americans race towards Santiago. Theodore Roosevelt, resigning as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, leads his volunteer Rough Riders up San Juan Hill to triumph. The United States takes over Cuba, naming Leonard Wood as governor. In 1902, Cuban independence, though first President Tomás Estrada Palma is reviled by later generations of patriots for granting the U.S. Navy its virtually perpetual lease at Guantanamo Bay. Roosevelt, now president and grumbling about that infernal little Cuban republic, intervenes in political squabbling. The U.S. again rules Cuba through William Howard Taft and another viceroy from 1906 to 1909. Then a 43-year succession of Cuban presidents, provisional presidents, and the odd dictator. Bullets fly in coups d'etat. Manuel Marquez holds the office for all of 17 hours in 1934, when part-time resident Ernest Hemingway describes unstable Cuba as this long, beautiful, unhappy island.
I'm on my way to Cuba. That's where I'm going. Cuba, that's where I'll stay.
By the 1920s, Havana's Morro Castle is a familiar sight for daiquiri-loving Americans on cruise ships. The young republic builds a presidential palace in 1920, a stunning capitol for its Congress in 1929, a national theater, heroic monuments, the seafront Malecón Promenade. Fulgencio Batista, the elected president from 1940 to 1944, realizes in 1952 that he's about to lose another election for the office. He stages a military coup, deposing President Carlos Príos Socarrás.
Cubanos y hermanos, hombres y mujeres, unidos en el mismo ideal, en la misma esperanza, en las mismas ilusiones.
Mobsters like Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Frank Costello and Santo Traficante have done business in Cuba since 1946, but under the corrupt Batista and his wife Marta, the dictator's bagwoman, the mob rakes it in from drugs, prostitution, and gambling as never before. Gangster Meyer Lansky becomes kingpin of Havana, controlling the Capri Casino Hotel, his new Riviera, even the landmark Hotel Nacional de Cuba.
Allí donde te conocí, quiero verte otra vez.
On the streets, a superficial prosperity, gleaming American cars, but under the surface, inequality, repression, torture, death at the hands of Batista thugs. On July 26, 1953, lawyer Fidel Castro leads an attack against the Army's Moncada barracks. Captured, he says at his trial, "History will absolve me." Freed in 1955, he meets the Argentinian Che Guevara in Mexico. With 80 followers, they invade Cuba in a boat named Granma in November 1956. Batista's troops ambush them, cut them down. The survivors flee into the steep jungles of the Sierra Maestra. Batista, an anti-communist supported to the end by President Eisenhower, claims Fidel is dead. Castro invites Herbert Matthews of the New York Times to Oriente Province to prove otherwise. The glamorized rebels go on. Inspired, 30 armed university students raid the presidential palace in a delivery truck in March 1957. Batista's forewarned guards killed them all. But as 1958 ends, Che Guevara wins a decisive battle at Santa Clara. Batista and the mobsters flee Cuba.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestra Mountains, Cuba's Fidel Castro emerged triumphant after 2 years of guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime.
Castro courts Americans at first, visiting the Lincoln Memorial. Interviewed by Edward R. Murrow, Cuba's new leader downplays communism.
Tell me, Fidel Castro, are you concerned at all about the communist influence in Cuba?
Oh, I am not worried because really there is no threat about communism here in Cuba.
Meanwhile, the revolution executes its perceived enemies. Amid expropriations of private property, wealthy and middle-class Cubans emigrate to Miami, demand action to overthrow Castro. The result, on April 15, 1961, the invasion by a CIA-backed force of Cuban exiles at Playa Girón on the Bay of Pigs. Everything goes wrong. Castro, openly communist now, nationalizes U.S. corporate property in Cuba. Under President Kennedy, the U.S. slaps on a damaging trade embargo, still in effect. Castro exaggerates it as a blockade. The sanctions strengthen revolutionary fervor. Cuba sí, Yankee no. Castro throws himself into the arms of Nikita Khrushchev in Moscow. On Castro's invitation, the Soviet Union starts to install ballistic missiles in Cuba. In the missile crisis of October 1962, Kennedy responds with a naval blockade. Khrushchev removes the missiles. Che Guevara, furious that Castro has stuck with the USSR after the humiliation over the missiles and Khrushchev's failure to demand that the Americans leave Guantanamo, goes off to export revolution to Bolivia. With CIA help, the Bolivian army kills Che at La Higuera in 1967. Fidel turns Che into Cuba's secular god. Over ensuing decades, thousands of Cuban rafters, balseros, risk the choppy straits of Florida to find U.S. shores. In 1976, time bombs destroy Cubana Airlines Flight 455 off Barbados, killing 76. Cuba repeatedly demands extradition of suspect Luis Posada Carriles, but he has grown old as a free man in Miami. 1980, Castro opens the port of Mariel to 125,000 Cubans who crowd boats sent from Miami. Castro pushes aboard the Mariel boat lift violent criminals, homeless winos, and the handicapped. He brags, "I have flushed the toilets of Cuba on the United States." 1996, Jose Basulto's Hermanos al Rescate planes have been dropping leaflets on Havana. Again, they head for Cuba. Cuban MiG fighters shoot down 2 planes outside Cuba's 12-mile limit, according to an international investigation, killing 4 men. Pope John Paul II eases the atmosphere in 1998 on a first-ever papal visit to Cuba. But in 2000, 5-year-old Elian Gonzalez, rescued at sea off Florida, is returned by Washington to his father in Cuba over the screams of the boy's Miami relatives. 2001. 5 Cuban intelligence officers are convicted of espionage in Miami, sentenced to long prison terms. Castro, making non-stop domestic propaganda out of the so-called Cuban Five, demands their freedom on the disputable claim that they spied only on potential terrorist groups. 2006. After 33 years as Cuba's president, weathering the country's economic near-collapse of the 1990s when Soviet bloc subsidies ended, the ailing Fidel turns the office over to younger brother Raul Castro. Fidel, honored at a Communist Party Congress in 2011, is clearly frail. Raul, to counter a limping economy, falling living standards, and potential threats to communist power, cautiously begins to allow some economic loosening but few political reforms in the one-party state. More opportunities for private business, permission to sell cars and houses. It's still a long way from the pro-business Chinese model. In March 2012, Pope Benedict XVI visits the shrine of Cuba's patron saint in Santiago, then meets Fidel Castro at Havana's Vatican Embassy. Castro, 86, looks awful, but in late October he makes a surprise appearance with Venezuela's former vice president aboard a minibus and at the Hotel Nacional. He says he's so healthy he can't even remember what a headache is. Strategically situated Cuba, 740 miles long and shaped like one of its crocodiles, is slightly smaller than Pennsylvania. For a country of 11 million people, fewer than in Los Angeles and Orange counties combined, Cuba has an outsized presence on the world stage, not least because of the alleged Muslim jihadists held by the U.S. military at Guantanamo Bay. Just as the prisoners cannot get out, few Americans have been getting into Cuba. In 2011, travel restrictions eased a bit with so-called people-to-people educational exchange tours sanctioned by the Obama administration. Up to 52,000 Americans a year took these trips, which Republican Senator Marco Rubio of Florida has called a charade, mere tourism that props up the Castro regime. Things are changing fast since the recent moves by Presidents Obama and Castro to normalize relations. With the last of the Cuban Five freed in 2014, the trade embargo persists, but barriers to ordinary travel are coming down. It may not be long before crowds of Americans rivaling those of Meyer Lansky's day return to the Hotel Nacional, sipping mojitos and thinking, "Viva Cuba!"